Dear Andres, dear Una, thank you very much for inviting me to this very fine company. It's my pleasure to be here, and I hope to give you a little different perspective on the Belt and Road synergies and challenges, as I'm an international economic lawyer, so I'm a little bit sidelined in this company usually, but hopefully it will add to your to a little bit to your perspective on this issue. So, distinguished guests, I will speak about the new era of China-EU investment protection, which is part of the synergies and challenges that the Belt and Road Initiative has brought about in the last few years. So, to keep my time, I will. Okay, I will just give you a brief introduction into the current state of where we stand in legal protection of international investment with respect to Chinese investors in the European Union or in individual European Union member states, as we are now, and reciprocally about the legal protection of EU investors in China. So I call this slide the past present of the EU-China investment protection, as due to this date we do not have a complex single investment protection mechanism to protect EU investors in China and Chinese investors in EU. To the contrary, we have individual bilateral investment treaties that have been concluded between China and individual EU member states since the 80s and 90s. The fact is that most of these bilateral investment treaties are first or second generation. To explain very shortly, they're mostly not providing the level of protection that a bilateral investment treaty should provide in case it is really considered to be effective. The most that we can expect from a bilateral investment treaty is to provide protection to investors in two phases. The first phase would be, of course, the pre-establishment phase, which is the market access. Then the protection of investors after entering the market of the host state. And the third phase, also very important for especially if the rights granted by the treaty are to be regarded as effective, is of course an existing effective dispute mechanism that would bring about actually the enforcement of the rights granted by the bilateral investment treaties. This is not to say that this very broad scope of an investment treaty is something we necessarily want to arrive at, as in the last 30 years it has been proven that this system of very broad investment treaties with full access to investment arbitration might be quite tricky. My country has faced 14 investment arbitrations, mostly from other investors from EU state in the last 15 years, and although we're quite lucky because we haven't lost as many, there are many countries in the world that really lost huge amounts of money that the host state had to pay to international investors, such as, for example, Argentina is the probably notorious example, which amounted a debt of $1.5 billion, which in investment arbitration awards towards foreign investors, which is of course not the situation that is ideal and is not the situation that host states would like to face in the future. There are several other lines of criticism of the existing system, and China has been wise enough in its bilateral investment treaties not to enter into such broad investment treaties. What I would like to point out next are the shortcomings with a question mark of the existing bilateral investment treaties, because it points out the limits to the existing legal regulation, although as we now know that the system is not perfect as it is, it might turn out not to be a shortcoming, but rather an opportunity to conclude new agreements that would be more viable and more apt to really address the balance protection between the rights of the investors and also the rights of the host states. So first shortcoming would be the limited scope of investment protection that the existing bilateral investment treaties between China and individual EU member states include, which means basically that they only address the post-establishment phase and they do not touch upon the market access, which we know is a key issue of discussions in recent years. The other problem is that the existing legal regulation is quite vague. So basically, in most of the bilateral investment treaties, the investment protection standards are not defined quite clearly. There is no legal definition that is binding basically to anyone. So there are investment protection standards called the fair and equitable treatment, for example, which no one really knows what it is. We can only draw from previous investment arbitration practice and decisions, awards of the previous tribunals, which are not binding upon anyone, but that's the only hint what actually the scope of, for example, the fair and equitable treatment standard includes. There's another standard called the full protection and security standard, which is also not clear whether it's a physical protection and security or legal protection and security. And this leads to an enormous amount of international investment arbitration awards, which are often quite contradictory and inconsistent. This brings huge amounts of risk to host states, which agreed to such large scopes of investment arbitration in their bilateral investment treaties, because they never know what the outcome will be of a possible investment arbitration, and usually the amounts of damages paid to investors are huge, in hundreds millions of either euros or US dollars. So basically, currently in this current system, there's a huge imbalance between the rights of the investors and the rights of the host states, as the regulatory power, the legitimate regulatory power of host states tends to be really limited by possible future investment arbitration that the host state can face if it takes legislative action, for example, in public interest, in cases of environmental regulation that needs to be adopted, or in cases some labor or social legislation needs to be changed, and this is to the detriment of the foreign investor. It oftentimes is sued in investment arbitration as breaching the fair and equitable treatment standard, which is basically breaching the legitimate expectations of the foreign investor. So just to give you a clear, very simple example, there have been many arbitrations, for example, between U.S. investors in Mexico, where Mexico adopted legislation in the environmental sphere, trying to bar U.S. companies of making landfills in Mexico, which already damaged the foreign investors from U.S. because they expected the Mexican poor legislation not to change. Of course, the Mexican state did its duty, changed the legislation in favor of its citizens in public interest, and the result was investment arbitration against United States of Mexico. Okay, so last point would be limited access to third-party international investment arbitration. As I said, it might be shortcoming, or maybe even a blessing in disguise, because investment arbitration is usually arbitration proceedings done by ad hoc tribunals, which are not really accountable to anyone. Currently there is no possibility to appeal investment arbitration awards, which brings about the risk and the reality of inconsistent awards and unclear and uncertain outcomes of such arbitrations. Okay, so the other way around. Okay, so what were the recent developments? So in the last 5 years, we have been following the EU-China 2020 strategic agenda for cooperation, which promotes qualities such as reciprocity, level playing field, and fair competition across all areas of cooperation, which sounds clear and natural, but these are not really qualities of the mutual relationship which is in place now, mostly due to differences in legal concepts, way of thinking, maybe rules and cultural traditions. As the cornerstone of bringing about the goals of this agenda, there is the need and also the process of negotiating the new EU-China investment agreement, which, if it is concluded, will come in place of these individual bilateral investment treaties that are now applicable to mutual relations. The maximum goal of this EU-China investment agreement is to improve investment conditions for both EU investors in China, Chinese investors in EU, through, of course, creating investment rights and non-discrimination, then improve transparency, which is very important, provide high and balanced level of protection for investors and investments, but of course mutual, and also allow host states to rule for example, in areas of public interest such as environmental and labor-related aspects of foreign investors. What are the recent examples of relevant practice in this area? As I said, investment protection currently is really not at its best place, globally speaking, and so on the side of the EU, we can look at CETA, which is the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement concluded between Canada and EU, and we can look at it as an example for the EU best practice recently, as it is considered to be the most modern and advanced investment treaty currently concluded by European Union. It is the maximum that European Union has been able to achieve in terms of investment protection. First, it provides mutual market access. It provides possibility for host states to regulate in a case of need in public interest. That means if the host state takes action, legislation in environmental and let's say labor issues, even to the detriment of the investors, it will not be considered a breach of investment protection standard. And also, with respect to dispute resolution, CETA doesn't bring a final solution, but it brings about a possibility to create a new mechanism that would also include the possibility of an appeal instance, which would bring the investment arbitration tribunals to be more accountable, and also the awards could also be revised if they're inconsistent or considered to be legally wrong. Now, on the side of China, it is interesting to point out the Chinese-Australian Free Trade Agreement, which includes a chapter on investment. Very interestingly, it does not really include, it does include provisions on market access, but they're non-reciprocal, which probably is not very likely to be accepted by the European Union if we take this as recent practice. Then also the Chinese International Economic and Trade Arbitration Commission has taken action last October and adopted new rules for international investment arbitration, which brings China closer to the international investment arbitration possibility in the future. And also a new development is the proposal for EU FDI screening mechanism, which also brings about a certain amount of let's say reciprocity in protecting, in mutual protecting markets from investment that could jeopardize certain national security interests of both sides. Okay, so the maximum goals we have is more clarity, transparency, and fairness in reciprocal rights and obligations if the EU-China investment agreement is concluded. If we do achieve balanced rights and obligations for both investors and host states, this will be a huge step not only for EU-China relations but for the entire international investment protection set of rules, global rules, and also improved international investment dispute resolution mechanism, which it's mostly likely to follow the path that was started in CETA. And also, if we clear the way for market access and certain other contentious issues in EU-China investment agreement, this could be the first step towards a possible future free trade agreement, maybe. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.